A first century prayer for us, 21st century disciples. If it seems a little different to you, we're not used to Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer as much as we're used to Matthew's version in chapter 6 of Matthew's Gospel. It almost seems abrupt and abbreviated. Hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. It's like stuff is missing, isn't it? Give us each day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses. Do not bring us to the time of trial. What does that even mean? It's so abbreviated. And so I thought we would just take a couple minutes to look at it as it appears in Matthew's Gospel, where we're used to it and where it seems like what we would call in English elliptical clauses have been left out. That's what an elliptical clause is. Where in Matthew's Gospel they're more complete and so they'd make more sense to us. So we're addressing our Abba who is in heaven and say, hallowed be your name. And whenever I read this, I think about how many times have I heard people taking God's name in vain this week, this day. Yeah, we don't think about it. It just flies off our lips sometimes. But holy is your name. Your kingdom come. In the first century, they talked about kingdom because that was the context in which they understood what they hoped Jesus would do and be for them. He wasn't. He was about the kingdom, about the family of God, about us who are sisters and brothers to one another. Not about a kingdom. What about a kingdom? Your kingdom come. And we need to think, as we've been thinking for the past couple of weeks, that every time when we read a prayer, there's a call to action. And every time there's a call to action, there is prayer that underlines it, and underscores it, and supports it. And that's what's happening here too. Your kingdom come. What are we doing to make others our sisters and brothers, even when it doesn't feel like they want to be our sisters and brothers, and even when they say they don't? What do we do anyway? Your kingdom come though, but your will be done. Your will be done. In the end, God will have God's way in the sense that if we as sisters and brothers come together to create kingdom, that is indeed the will of God and it will happen. But honestly, a good part of it is up to us. It's up to us. Because this prayer is so radical, such a radical call to be kingdom, to be brothers and sisters with one another. It goes on to say, and so does Luke's, give us this day our daily bread. Give us this day. Not tomorrow, not throughout the week, not next month, but give us this day our daily bread. So that we count on God each and every day to give us what we need that day as our sustenance, as our nurturance. But we don't say, give us a whole bunch more because we need to fill up our freezers. Hurricane season's here, we got to make sure we got stuff. That's not what it says. Rely on the Lord. Forgive us our debts. And here I think is the crucial word in this sentence, as we forgive our debtors. Forgive us as we forgive. Think about that. Do you really want to be forgiven as you forgive? Or do you really want to be forgiven as God forgives? It's a call to action. It's a call to our hearts. It's a call to go deeper with God. Forgive as you want to be forgiven. Forgive. You are forgiven as you forgive. Think about what that means. Think about what Jesus is radically saying to his gang and to us. And do not bring us to the time of trial. We're not really sure. That word changes with the different translations. Sometimes it's temptation, sometimes it's death, sometimes it's persecution. We're thinking in this particular text in Matthew, not necessarily Luke because it's not there, but in Matthew, they think that Matthew actually added that, perhaps because the Matthean church was being persecuted. rescue us from the evil one. Who's the evil one? Sometimes I think it means rescue me from that which is evil in me. Rescue me from that which is evil in me. Let me not be evil. Let me be your disciple. Let me be one who is of love, not of selfishness, not of judgment, not of persecution. So I just thought, let's look at the whole of it before we go back and look at what else Luke says. When I was in the convent, there were a couple of books out on prayer. Actually, there were hundreds of books out on prayer, and I read two. That there were other things that I did when I was in chapel besides read prayer books, but mostly it was sleep. One was a book that talked about pray constantly. Pray constantly. So when we're called to pray constantly, what does that mean? Do you feel like you're praying constantly? Because I think what it means is all our actions, as well as our thoughts and what we think are our prayers, are our prayer. So what we're doing, as well as what we're thinking and saying and praying, all that is part of our prayer. We need to make sure it's focused on the right stuff. And again, that's up to us. The other book was called Noisy Contemplation. And I thought, well, how true is that for us? It was true in the 20th century. It's true in the 21st century too. How much of what we're trying to do, we find ourselves in a space where it's noisy contemplation, where no matter what our focus is, we get pulled away by this and pulled away by that and pulled away by something else. And the author of that book, I don't remember who it was, would say, but that's okay, because all that can be part of your prayer too. You don't have to sit there and be thinking it's just you and God, because I'm thinking pretty much God is with a lot of other people, not just me, when I'm praying. So I just wanted to bring that up, that it's prayer and contemplation and action that we get called to. Matt Skinner, who's one of the people I read, says when the disciple goes and asks Jesus, "Teacher, teach us how to pray," Matt Skinner says, don't turn to Jesus in Scripture for ruminations on techniques, models, and best practices. And how many times do we do that? We're like, teach me how to pray, He says instead, go there to discover what love looks like. Love in action, love for God and neighbor. And I think that's what we're being called to. Love in action. Love for God. But where do we find God? In one another, among other places, in creation. And of course there's God's self, whatever that energy is, whatever that creator is, whatever that God is. Now remember, in the first century, it was a very patriarchal century. So of course Jesus would use the word Abba rather than Amma, which would be mother. We use both in the United Church of Christ. But don't forget that Abba was an intentional choice of his. He did not use a formal word that meant father. He used Abba, which almost every translator will tell you is a very intimate, familial term. I don't know what you called your own parents, your fathers, whoever they were for you, biological or otherwise. But it's an intimate term that means daddy, or papa, or dada even. Very, very intimate, something a child would use. And so Jesus is trying to pull us back to that time of our innocence, I think, as children, and say, get this. This is the relationship where you had full and total trust in who Papa or Daddy was for you and what he could do. And I think that's something we need to think about. Which then brings us to sort of the end of today's reading, where Jesus talks about children. And he says to us, is there anyone among you who, if your child, and he personalizes it, he doesn't say a child, if your child asks for a fish, will give a snake instead? Now I know some of you down here love the Black Racers. I know you think the rat snakes are terrific, but truly, was that what you would give to your child if your child came to you and asked for food? Or if the child asks for an egg, who will give a scorpion? I don't know about y'all, and I know some of you like snakes, but scorpions, they're a little creepy. So he's pulling our attention from the general to the very specific. Who among us would do this to our own child? And I don't think he's thinking any of us would. So then I thought, maybe I should look for something about children. And since we're celebrating Christmas in July, I went to my treasure chest of Christmas stories and I pulled 3 out that had to do with children, and I just want to share those with you briefly. One comes to us from 1964 and is set among the sailors who at that time manned the USS Sam Houston, which was a submarine based in, get this, Holy Loch, Scotland. And the story begins, it's a true story, and it's told in the American Submariner magazine by this man named Jim Terrell. It's the story of his folk, his gang. And he says, you know, we're all boarding this plane, it's Christmas time, and we know we need to do this, this is our duty, we're headed off, and we're going to relieve people who have been on duty so they come home and be with their kids and their families, but it also means we will not be with our wives and our children. He said, so everybody's, you know, a little saddened on the trip over. But on the plane over, somebody gets up and says, hey, if we can't be with our own kids, why don't we find kids we can be with? And so they get to Scotland, they wave goodbye to their pals who are going home to their families, and they find an orphanage in town. And they go, and I don't know who they sent, but they sent somebody over, and they got ages, names and ages and gender of these kids that they were then going to bring over. They were going to use a tender. Any Navy people that are tender? Okay, which is what, like a little boat? Mm-hmm. To bring them over to the submarine. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's what they were going to do. So they do. Then they get this little skinny guy to be Santa Claus. I guess he was the only volunteer. And of course the Santa Claus suit doesn't fit him, but the kids are British, if you will. They're English, you know, they're Scots. And so they're not expecting Santa Claus. They're expecting Father Christmas. So they get Santa Claus. So then somebody comes up with the bright idea saying to them, no worries, we specially brought just for you the American Santa Claus so you can have an American Christmas. And they talk about how at the end, the little kids were crying because they had to go back to the orphanage and leave their daddies behind. Those guys on the submarine who had become their daddies for the day, who brought them gifts and played with them and cared for them in a way that they had no one else to care for them. I think that's the same kind of story that Jesus was talking about, the same kind of action. And it had to come from somebody with faith of some sort, because it's so unselfish. We can't be with our own children. Let's be with children who don't have daddies. And that's the first story. The second story is about a little boy in Zambia. And his name of all things is Kennedy. I can't find, these are all true stories, I can't find what year this was set in, but there were missionaries there. And the Moira, who was the ministry team leader's wife, had just read Nehemiah 8:10, which says, "Go home and prepare a feast, holiday food and drink, and share it with those who have nothing. This day is holy to God. The joy of God is your strength." And so that missionary group, no longer sailors, but a missionary group, decided they would find orphans and give them Christmas. And one of the orphans was named Kennedy. Moira told us about Kennedy, but I was not prepared for my encounter with him. Kennedy could draw a gasp, a 12-year-old boy so emaciated with open sores on a frail body folded up like an accordion. But that wasn't what commanded my attention. It was his eyes. His eyes mesmerized me. I was transfixed by his clear, wise gaze. Here was a boy who, in his 12 short years of life, knew more about emotional and physical pain and loss than many know in a lifetime. His eyes spoke of hope. And then Christmas came to Kennedy. We had come to Lulu, a shanty town of 60,000, and some of us went to Kennedy's home. Kennedy was an orphan. His parents had died of AIDS, and he lived with his grandmother. He spent most of his days sitting in his folded up position, watching the world with those penetrating eyes. His grandmother's wish was for a wheelchair, so Kennedy could go to school, though everyone knew he was too sick to use a wheelchair. Kennedy's mother brought him on her back to a Jesus film that the missionaries were showing. During the scene of Jesus healing the lame man, the person who wrote this felt compelled to reach her hand towards Kennedy, and without touching him, she prayed that Jesus would somehow transform his life. Several days later, the team arranged for Kennedy to be taken by them to a doctor in the city of Kabwe. This woman kept praying for a miracle, and then they heard he's not HIV positive. And the doctor believes that with surgery, Kennedy will walk again. Christmas for an orphan, and a Christmas miracle for all who were there. The third story, and I've shared this one before, it's about a little boy named Misha, and he's from Russia. And back in 1994, 2 American missionaries went to Russia, and among other things, went to an orphanage. And they had translators with them, and they were teaching the children the Jesus story, the nativity story, the story of Jesus' birth. And at the end of it, they had like little pieces of cloth and little pieces of cardboard, little pieces of whatever. You know, you crafty people know what that stuff is. And they gave each child whatever these materials were so that the child could make a manger with Jesus in it. So they're going around the room and they're looking at all these kids making their mangers, and they get to Misha. And when they get to Misha, he's got his little manger scene all made, but he's got 2 babies in the manger. So the leader says, guy's name is Will Fish, I called for the translator to ask him why there were 2 babies in the manger. Crossing his arms in front of him and looking at the completed manger, the child Misha began to repeat the Christmas story. For such a young child who had heard the story once, he related the events accurately until he came to Mary putting the baby Jesus in the manger. There, Misha made up his own ending. And when Maria laid the baby in the manger, Jesus looked at me and asked me if I had a place to stay. I told him, I have no mama and no papa, so I don't have any place to stay. Then Jesus told me I could stay with him. But I told Jesus I couldn't because I didn't have a gift to give him like everybody else did. I wanted to stay with Jesus so much. So I thought about what I had that I could use for a gift. I thought if I kept him warm, that would be a good gift. Remember, this is cold Russia. So I asked Jesus, if I keep you warm, will that be a good enough gift? And Jesus told me, that will be the best gift that anybody ever gave me. I got in the manger. Jesus looked at me and said, I could stay with him for always. We don't give a child a scorpion. We don't give a child a snake. We give a child what that child needs, because that's what this prayer, this piece of scripture today is calling all of us to do. We don't say to the child at the border, we're taking you from your mother and your father. And we're going to put you in some place that's so cold and so awful and so mean and nasty and dirty that you will spend every night crying. We don't do that. We're part of Jesus' disciples in the 21st century, and we're called to take care of the children, all of the children. Amen.
Amen.